There is a behavior that people who have loved a dismissive avoidant describe more consistently than almost any other. The sense that when a choice had to be made between the avoidant's comfort and the relationship's needs, or between the avoidant's comfort and their partner's well-being, or between the avoidant's comfort and almost anything else, the comfort won. Almost every time. Not dramatically, not through a deliberate declaration that their own ease was more important than whatever the other person needed, but through the quiet, consistent accumulation of small choices that each individually could be explained away, but that together formed an unmistakable pattern. The conversation that got changed when it became uncomfortable, the plan that was canceled when something more appealing presented itself, the emotional need that was acknowledged and then gently redirected, the moment of someone else's difficulty that was met with the minimum viable response before the avoidance attention moved back to the equilibrium they were quietly working to restore. And the person on the receiving end of that pattern was left with a specific, difficult question. Do I actually matter to them? Or do I matter only as long as mattering does not cost them their comfort? I want to answer that question honestly today, not to defend the pattern, not to excuse its impact, but because I think understanding where the comfort prioritization actually comes from changes something essential about how it is carried by the people it affects. Let me start at the beginning. The dismissive avoidant did not decide to prioritize their comfort over connection. They were taught that comfort and connection were not simultaneously available. In the developmental environment that produces dismissive avoidant attachment, the child learns something fundamental about emotional needs, that expressing them did not produce relief, that reaching for connection, for comfort, for the reassurance of a consistent and attuned caregiver produced outcomes that ranged from indifference to active discouragement. Not necessarily cruelty, often simply absence. The parent who was not equipped to provide emotional attunement, the family system in which feelings were private matters to be handled without burdening others, the environment in which self-sufficiency was modeled as the appropriate response to difficulty and need, was treated, implicitly or explicitly, as weakness. And the child, who cannot survive without attachment, and who is extraordinarily adaptive in the service of maintaining whatever attachment is available, learn to reorganize, to need less, to feel less, or at least to be less aware of feeling, to build an identity around not requiring what was not being provided, to locate comfort not in connection with others, but in the reliable, controllable, consistent experience of their own inner world and their own competence and their own ability to manage without. That reorganization was not a character flaw, it was survival. But the child grew up, and the survival strategy became the personality, and the personality entered relationships carrying a nervous system that had been trained to treat its own interior regulation as the primary and most reliable source of safety. Which means that when the dismissive avoidant is in a relationship and something arises that threatens that interior regulation, something that creates discomfort or demands emotional energy, or requires them to inhabit their own vulnerability in order to be present for someone else, the system does what it was built to do. It moves towards comfort, not away from you, exactly, towards itself. The distinction matters, because the movement is not about you being insufficient or unimportant or not worth the effort. The movement is about a nervous system executing the only program it was given for managing distress, which is to return to the self, to the inner equilibrium, to the place where the avoidant is in control of their own experience and not responsible for managing anyone else's, to the comfort of their own company, their own thoughts, their own defined and predictable and undemanding interior world. Now let me say something about what this produces in relationships, because the impact is real even when the intention behind it is not malicious. The person in relationship with a dismissive avoidant eventually learns to manage their own needs with a particular kind of care, not because they are told to, but because experience teaches them over time that certain needs will consistently produce a kind of management response from the avoidant that is ultimately more isolating than simply not expressing the need would have been. So they edit, they calibrate, they develop an increasingly sophisticated sense of which versions of their needs are small enough to be received and which are large enough to require the private processing that the avoidance comfort has quietly made necessary. And that editing is a cost, a significant one, paid quietly and often invisibly, accumulated over months and years, until the person doing the editing has become someone meaningfully smaller than who they were when the relationship began. That is the damage of the comfort prioritization. Not any single instance of the avoidant choosing ease over engagement, but the cumulative effect of a relationship in which one person's comfort has been, by the structure of the dynamic, consistently more protected than the other person's needs. So what does the dismissive avoidant need to understand about this? The first thing is that their comfort is not neutral in the context of a relationship. When you are alone, your comfort affects only you. Your preference for equilibrium, your need for internal regulation, your movement away from discomfort and towards the settled experience of your own self-sufficiency, all of that is yours to navigate however you choose. But in a relationship, your comfort exists in relation to another person, and consistently choosing it over their needs is not a personal preference with no external consequence. It is an ongoing choice about whose experience takes priority. And that choice, made again and again in the small moments, shapes the other person's sense of their own worth within the relationship in ways that go very deep. The second thing is that the discomfort they are consistently moving away from is not the threat it feels like. I know that is easy to say. I know that the nervous system does not respond to intellectual reassurance. But the dismissive avoidant who is doing genuine work has to grapple with this at some point. The discomfort of someone else's need is not the same as the emotional overwhelm that taught you, as a child, that other people's feelings were more than you could manage. The person in front of you is not the parent who was too much, or the family system that required you to be the stable one, or the environment that produced the original reorganization. They are a person who needs something, and you are an adult who has more capacity than you were taught you had. The third thing is that choosing comfort consistently and choosing connection consistently are not always compatible. And at some point, the dismissive avoidant has to decide which one they are actually prioritizing. Not in the abstract, in the daily, specific, small moments where the choice presents itself. The conversation that is getting uncomfortable, stay or redirect. The emotional need being expressed, engage or manage. The moment that requires genuine presence rather than functional adequacy. Show up or maintain the equilibrium. Those choices, made differently than the pattern recommends, are not comfortable, but they are where the relationship either becomes real or remains a comfortable arrangement that serves the avoidant's needs while quietly starving the other person's. And the dismissive avoidant who is honest with themselves, who has looked clearly at the pattern and what it has cost the people they have been close to, knows the difference between what they have been choosing and what love actually requires. Not the absence of comfort, not the dissolution of the self into someone else's needs, but the willingness, in specific moments, to tolerate the discomfort of genuine presence. For someone who has spent their whole life moving away from exactly that, the willingness to stay.